Morning. Well, good morning. Early in session, we rolled out our 2020 vision, and one of the things that we had broad discussion about what we wanted to focus on was violence prevention, making sure that the public was safe. And so today we're going to give you the specifics about what we said there. And the overriding theme is we want to protect Minnesotans and we want to prosecute criminals.
Good morning. For the record, I'm Warren Limmer, Chairman of Judiciary and Crime Prevention Committee in the Senate. Today's agenda focuses on violence prevention. As a reminder, we've had 2 informational hearings since December regarding this important subject. Minnesotans deserve a safe place to live, work, and play anywhere in this state. And yet we keep seeing a rising increase in violent crime being reported in our news agencies almost every single day. The violent crime, as I said, is on the rise, according to the reports of our newspapers. The homicide rate in St. Paul skyrocketed last year, and in large part due to gang violence and the rise in illicit drug trade. Police Chief Axtell has repeatedly warned us of the growing problem and that it's spreading in our state. As I mentioned before, we had informational hearings. The first one was in December. During that time, we reviewed for about 4 hours the existing gun laws and the firearm eligibility for owning those firearms in our committee. We did a very deep dive into what we know as existing law. Vitally important, if you're going to consider any new gun laws, we need to have context of where Minnesota has been and where it might be going. Several of our members at that time recognized contributing factors to violence as it relates to gangs, domestic abuse, and mental illness. We also focused on reviewing these current Minnesota gun laws, which revealed the strength of our gun laws, but it also revealed some inconsistencies and omissions. Between 2010 and 2018, the fastest growing crime in Minnesota is the possession of a firearm by a convicted felon who committed a crime of violence and therefore already ineligible to own a firearm. But in the last 5 years, 40% of the time, prosecutors and judges are refusing to sentence the mandatory minimum that the legislature established years ago for violent crimes committed by felons with guns. We have a specific mandatory sentence that we have advised the judiciary to follow. Again, 40% of the time they are refusing to sentence felons with a gun. In January, we had a hearing in Hibbing, Minnesota. We decided to have an opportunity for outstate Minnesota to give us their opinion and their reaction. And quite honestly, we had a very robust testimony in Hibbing on a wide variety of firearm proposals. We considered Senator Latz and gave him a hearing at that time in Hibbing regarding his universal background checks and his red flag laws. We also considered other issues on the other side of the political spectrum, things like constitutional carry and stand your ground laws. As I've stated many times in the past, we have a reality that we have to deal with. We have a divided government. We have a political spectrum that stretches across both sides. We have in the House, of course, we have it dominated by liberals, and in the Senate, we have it dominated by conservatives. Taking up any extreme gun bill is going to be very difficult to pass in the other chamber. So we've now presented, or we will be presenting a committee hearing today recognizing specific proposals. I've been very clear that we need common sense solutions. I've had this discussion for about 2 years. common sense solutions that we can all live with, and we can claim a bipartisan victory on issues that face or that are concerning violence and violence prevention in the state of Minnesota. Today's bills are meant to build consensus that we will be hearing not only in our committee later this afternoon, but we'll also be learning of other proposals as well at this hearing. There are 7 bills on the Judiciary Committee agenda today, and you'll be hearing a few more than just that. The first bill that I'd like to have the author describe is Senator Pratt. Senator Pratt?
Thank you, Senator Limmer. Hi, my name is Eric Pratt. I'm from Senate District 55, Prior Lake, Shakopee, Jordan, basically Scott County. Today in Minnesota, people who are subject to child abuse or domestic abuse protection orders, or those who have been convicted of domestic assault, stalking, or harassment, may be prohibited from possessing firearms. Individuals are required to surrender their firearms today within 3 days of the order being issued by a judge in a court, and then turning in an affidavit stating and detailing where those weapons are being held. However, currently, there's no process to ensure that that order is complied with. And compliance has been generally low across the state of Minnesota. In fact, media reports last year showed that compliance rate was under 4%. To remedy this, Senate File 2101, which is the bill that I'm authoring, would require the courts to follow up within 10 days if the paperwork hasn't been submitted back to the court showing that the individual hasn't actually complied with the court order. This is simply about compliance. These people have already had their day in court, and they've already been ordered to surrender their firearms, and it seems to me to make common sense for us to follow up. I'm also co-author on Senate File 2596 that Senator Paul Anderson has chief authored, and this legislation would increase the penalties for someone who intentionally buys a gun and transfers that firearm to a known criminal, and it increases it from a gross misdemeanor to a felony. Violent crime, as Senator Limmer said, is on the rise in our state, and this is part of a solution that addresses straw purchasers. According to Minnesota Sentencing Guidelines Commission, the fastest growing crime, one of the fastest growing crimes is possession of a firearm by a convicted felon. Now, with both of these bills, we already have laws on the books. Part of the legislature's job is to make sure that, or part of the legislature's job is to look at these and see if it's an enforcement problem or if we need to enhance the laws that we have on the books. And in both these cases, I think we're looking at enforcement and making improvements. Thank you.
The next proposal will be by Senator Lang.
Well, good morning. My name is Senator Andrew Lang. I'm from southwestern Minnesota in Senate District 17. The bill that I have up before you will be up before you this afternoon actually is Senate File 3865. This bill has everything to do with the state complying with federal standards when it comes to the permit application, the permit to carry application. Realistically, I think it's important that we look at how the federal laws are aligned, how the state laws are aligned, and if they align with each other. And this really as being a technical modification to the bill, but that being said, it's important nonetheless. So what it does is last fall we had one of 2 letters was sent out to all the locally federally licensed firearm dealers that said the conceal and carry permit that you have, the application process is not aligned with federal law. So this is a technical change, but it's an important one nonetheless. So that's about it for that small bill. But
And then Senator Ingebrigtsen has 2 proposals.
Thank you. The 2 proposals that I have are pretty straightforward. We have now on the books a drive-by shooting statute. That statute actually was enforced, but it was ruled. Whoever was charged with this was they were in rural Minnesota. There was no buildings in the background. The Supreme Court ruled that if there is no buildings in the background, it's not the same, which makes no sense whatsoever. So this is tweaking the bill. A drive-by shooting is a drive-by shooting, no matter whether it's in a suburb area or in a rural area. Your intention is to shoot somebody when you do a drive-by shooting, very simply. And it would happen, it would now be the same sanction in a rural Minnesota setting, or as a matter of fact, inside a city park where there may not be a building in the background. The other bill is something that I never thought in 34 years of law enforcement that I would ever see have to come forward. But a couple of years ago, we had a couple of politicians in the metro area that talked about disarming law enforcement in the state of Minnesota. I actually had to have another look at that particular news media event in order to even believe it. So what this bill does, it disallows sheriffs, chiefs, mayors, anybody with authority over law enforcement, disallows them to disarm law enforcement in the state of Minnesota. So it's pretty straightforward. Disarming the people that are charged with protecting us all seems to be totally off in left field. This should remedy that situation in the future. Thank you.
The next senator is Senator Hall.
Good morning. I have two bills. My first bill has to do with the transit systems we have. Bill 3912 will require cameras in all light rail trains, and it increases police presence on the same. We believe that the number one job in Minnesota is to protect our Minnesota families. That's most important. We have a public transit crisis right now. How many of us would take the transit without thinking first, how safe am I going to be on here? The answer is not to cut fare prices, as some would say, or to lessen the penalties of evading the fare price. The bill, my bill, includes requiring cameras on all light rails and buses and increasing police presence on and around the transit system. The reform is there to protect Minnesota's families, which they need every day because they're out using it every day. Because Minnesota's families shouldn't have to fear being victimized when they're on public transit. My mother walks around Lake Nokomis every day. She's 87 years old. She doesn't need to fear that somebody's going to mug her, somebody's going to rob her. Let's remember, ensuring public safety is our number one job. My second bill is Senate File 3574. This is a great bill. It says that there is an increased penalty if you are a gang member and you decide to carry an illegal firearms. It changes the mandatory or the sentence from a misdemeanor to a felony. Again, this legislation protects our Minnesota families. In 2019, as Senator Limmer stated, and specifically in the Twin Cities, we saw a large increase in homicides, in some areas over 100% increase. Many of these events were a direct result of gang violence, including the terrifying shooting that we had at the State Fair last year. We need to take gang violence very seriously and ensure that our communities are not in their crosshairs. My legislation here gives law enforcement and criminal justice partners the tools and authority they need to send a loud, clear message to criminals. Gang members with their illegal guns are going to be punished.
Thank you, Senator Hall. The bill that I have is Senate File 3866. It might surprise you, but our statutes on firearm ineligibility do not cover civilly committed sex offenders. As you know, there's been some changes in that program, the MSOP program, and eventually some of those individuals may move or graduate to, let's say, a halfway house or other supervised release provisions. We had that opportunity to study issues like that in December when we were looking for context of these laws regarding firearms, and we noticed that there is nothing in state statute that explicitly prohibits those individuals coming out of a a civilly committed sexual offender program from owning a firearm. My legislation closes this loophole by adding civilly committed sex offenders to the reason why a person would be ineligible to possess a firearm. All of these ideas that you heard about firearms are common sense. They're simple, and yet they're vitally important for the protection of our families and our children in the state of Minnesota. It's extremely important that in this class of offender that we close that loophole. Other bills before us will be two more. Senator Rosen has one, and then we'll move on to Senator Chamberlain. Senator Rosen?
Thank you. Well, good morning. I'm Senator Julie Rosen, and I'm honored to serve some counties in southern Minnesota, District 23. And in Minnesota, we have a specialized unit called the Violent Crime Enforcement Teams, or VSET. And they are tasked with taking down dangerous, violent narcotic traffickers, gang members, and related other violent offenders. We've funded these teams in recent years, and they have been extremely successful. They're right now currently 21 teams or units that span 70 counties, but they have not had an increase in funding for over 10 years, and they are strapped, and they are at their limits as far as what the capacity they can do. So the bill basically funds greater Minnesota counties to expand their scope and their work out there, because these counties in greater Minnesota, besides Olmsted and St. Louis County, do not receive HIDA dollars. And that's the big distinction between the metro and greater Minnesota. Drug seizures went up across the board last year. Meth seizures up almost 650% in the last 5 years, and heroin, cocaine, and fentanyl seizures are all up. And this is a huge issue. Like I said, for greater Minnesota, it is meth. 75% of crime in greater Minnesota, as one of my sheriffs says, is related to meth. And you can look at pretty much every county, and they would say that their out-of-home placement costs are increasing, a very strong sign that our children are in need of some law enforcement, some protection. And I've been working on this issue since I've been elected. I was elected in 2002. 2003, we started working on methamphetamine and stopping the meth labs. And we were very successful with that by putting the pseudoephedrine behind the counter. But now we have, even though the number of labs are down significantly to 4, I believe, last year, we are seeing an importation of meth that's more cheaper, it's more pure, it's a very high quality, and it is extremely, extremely dangerous. So we as Republicans are committed to dedicating more money to our law enforcement, to getting the funds out there to stop these violent offenders. Thank you.
Senator Chamberlain?
Good morning. As they've been saying, protecting our families and communities and keeping them safe is our number one priority. We have listened to, met with, and spoke and heard from police and citizens and communities. And we are going to act on that. They've had requests. You've heard some of them. If Minneapolis-St. Paul cannot adequately protect their citizens, we're going to help them do that. We all have citizens and constituents that go to these two cities. We need vibrant inner cities. They need to be safe. We have constituents going down there. It is all of our responsibility. So, nationwide average for police to citizen ratio is about 3. That's a good average. Some are 4. The average, 3 per 1,000. The average for Minneapolis-St. Paul is 2 per 1,000 residents. Our bill is simple. It requires Minneapolis-St. Paul to use 10% of their local government aid dollars to add more police officers until they reach the national average of 3 per 1,000. For Minneapolis, that's about 400 officers, and that is what the police chief had requested of their council. The whole state has a vested interest in this because we go to Vikings games, concerts, and eat at restaurants in these cities. People want more police on the street to prevent crime. They want safe neighborhoods. They want their kids to be safe when they're in the park and riding their bikes and walking from school. We're going to make sure Minneapolis-St. Paul do their part and keep up their end of the deal. Thank you.
We can open it up for questions if you have any.
Can you speak to which of these bills have bipartisan support?
Right now, this is the Republican proposal to addressing violence in the state of Minnesota. We'll have that opportunity to pursue that. I think all of these ideas are rather common sense. They don't pursue a political agenda of any kind. And we'll be presenting some of these later this afternoon in the Senate Judiciary Committee. We'll see if it's a bipartisan effort or not.
Or mine is. Mine is.
Go ahead.
Thank you. That's a great question, and mine is Representative Sandstead from Hibbing has the bill, and she's very dedicated to working on this. They have a huge methamphetamine issue up there. Thank you.
So is this essentially the Senate Republican answer to what House DFLers passed last week? And then these will sort of cancel each other and it'll be status quo at the end of session?
Well, as I tried to explain earlier in my comments, we have a political reality that we have to deal with. Extreme gun and firearm issues really are not going to pass in the respective other body. The House has given us their idea, and they've gone forward with universal background checks, which I would call universal owner registration, gun owner registration. And then they also have the red flag laws that are beginning to raise questions in law enforcement communities where they're backing out of their previous support for such bills. These proposals, or the process that we went through, also gave hearings for some of the other proposals on another side of a political spectrum, those being stand your ground and constitutional carry. As a chairman of that committee that's going to deal with these issues, I don't think those would be successfully passed in the House either. So we're presenting this series or a collection of legislation in order to gather consensus and bipartisan support. I don't know how you could not support these. These are common sense. These are attractive to anyone, and they will protect families and citizens going about their everyday life. We're responding, and we're also reminding the judiciary that the intent of ignoring 40% of felons that are carrying guns and not issuing that mandatory sentence is wrong. The legislature decided years ago that a mandatory sentence was vitally important to stem the tide of felons with guns. And the judiciary has ignored that to the point of 40% of the time those very same felons are in front of them and found guilty. That is not what the legislature intended. We want felons that are using a gun to be locked up and make our citizens safe.
I'm just wondering about the need on some of these. For instance, your bill on sex offenders. Is there anybody in MSOP who isn't a convicted felon?
Yeah, there would be. Keep in mind, civilly committed means exactly that. You're judged by a court that you need to be civilly committed. It doesn't require a criminal conviction. And so, yes, there are some that are there purely as civilly committed.
Any idea how many?
I don't have that number with me right now.
Senator Hall still up there?
Yeah. He
All right,
disappeared.
I won't ask him a question.
Okay.
I just had a couple questions about 3973 on the LGA requirement. Currently, are there any restrictions, like when a city gets LGA aid, are there any restrictions on them at all? And do you know how much LGA Minneapolis and St. Paul get And also, I'm wondering what the source is for the average police to citizen ratio?
Right. So, a couple of things. First, the money that the LGA, the local government aid that is distributed, is collected from all of you. We are essentially, the citizens of the state are, then we're taking it in, then we're giving that to other cities based on certain formulas. We, as citizens, have a right to put conditions on those dollars. Restrictions, not necessarily, but we have a formula. We make the formula, and we decide how that formula can go. We can go in today and move something around, change some language, and that would restrict people, cities and counties from getting LGA. So in a way, there are restrictions because the formula is a restriction. So first, the money comes from all of us. We give it to them. Therefore, we can make the restrictions. It's a loan, if you will. And then the formula itself functions as a restriction because some cities get it, some cities don't. The other part of your question, I got the data and the information right from the city of Minneapolis, and it's also available online. But the cities of similar, Minneapolis has more people now, about 416,000 last count, and they have fewer officers than they did when they had around 390,000. So the data comes from national sources and from the Minneapolis police officers. And like I said, the 3 per 1,000 gets us to that 400 over about 6 years. And that is, 400 is the number the Minneapolis police chief had made request of his city council, and they said no. So that's, the data comes from the police, comes from national sources, and from, well, the chief of police in Minneapolis himself.
But other than the formula, you're saying there aren't specific conditions and haven't been for all the years that LGA aid has been?
I can't say conclusively that's true, because I have not gone back and looked at all those years. There might be, may have been, but the formula itself is a restriction because not all cities get it. And like I said, we give it to them, we should put conditions on it. And our number one job here is making sure citizens are safe. And so I think it's perfectly sound.
Do you know how much Minneapolis and St. Paul get?
Oh, yeah. Well, they have about 14% of the population, give or take, 13, 14. They get about 25 to 28% of the LGA. And Minneapolis right around 75 million, give or take, for Minneapolis.
Why single out Minneapolis and St. Paul and not make it a percentage across the board for all cities?
Because Minneapolis and St. Paul are suffering the most. The citizens in those communities and those cities are suffering the most. They have told us as much. Now, there are certainly problems outstate, and those have to be addressed, as Senator Rosen mentioned. But the problems in Minneapolis and St. Paul are the most severe, most critical, as many of you have seen and reported and experienced yourself. That is why we're focusing on those two cities. They're our big main core cities. They need to be safe, strong, and vibrant. As Minneapolis and St. Paul go, maybe the rest of the state goes. So we don't want them to fail, but more importantly, we want safe citizens in their communities. We met with people in their church in North Minneapolis, and we talked to them. They said, we want police. We want eyes up here. Because they know a lot of these people are getting out of jail. They said they're getting out of jail, they're going to be back on the streets this summer, and they're going to be threatening the lives of our children riding bikes and walking to and from the park. So, and the press conference that Mayor Fry had at City Hall, I watched that. Yeah, that was, what, a month and a half ago? So those two cities are the most severe, most critical, they're top priority.
There's other African-American leaders in the Twin Cities who told us, reporters, that they thought a more effective way to curb violence would be to put some more funding into groups that work with youth. Is there a way to do both? Do you see that as an effective solution?
Well, I think there's always a way to do both, and these folks behind me could certainly speak to that. There's always ways to do both. This is not either or, right? This is not either or. This is both and. But right now, we need to enforce. I would suggest you contact, I can give you some contact information of good citizens up in North Minneapolis. You can go talk to them. Go talk to them and they'll tell you. They live it every day. So if you want that information from the ground, from the heart, from the soul of it, I can get you that information. You can go talk to them. Because that's where we went. That's what they requested. They've requested most of this stuff. Enforcement. They want enforcement. They want cops there to find them, stop them, arrest them. Then they want the penalties increased, and they want the bad guys in prison.
So,
I know Senator Hall has left, but does anybody know, don't the light rail, they already have cameras, don't they? Or is it not a requirement, or are you trying to get more cameras? And is that a funded mandate here? I know that they have cameras, there are cameras on light rail things, but is this, what's
This
this?
would be added cameras, added police officers. There's a number of proposals out. Senator Hall has his proposal. This would require a little bit more money, but we're starting the dialogue now. There seems to be a problem on our light rail tracks, and citizens are being threatened, they're being victimized, and we're not going to stand by and let that happen if other jurisdictions fail to address the resources that are necessary to keep that light rail safe. Senator Ingebrigtsen, he left. He kept tugging my coat, saying, "I'd like to make a comment about your previous question," but he had to leave, so I thought he was right behind me. Are there any other questions?
On a somewhat related topic, Senator Latz and Representative Hornstein have brought forth a bill dealing with hate crimes, toughening some of the statute around those. Would you give that bill a hearing? Have you looked at that yet?
I've looked at it briefly. We're still reviewing it. The major concern is how it balances with our First Amendment rights. And so we're just reviewing right now. And we haven't created our full docket yet for the rest of the year. Stay tuned. Any other questions? Guess we're done. Thank you.